The future that Alexander promised was an empire that would spread across 2 million square miles. Greek towns and Greek language and culture were established deep into Asia, some as far from their source as India. Alexander died when he was only 33, and his monumental project could not sustain itself. But the model of the Greek state he exported, of a civilized city in a barbarian landscape, became the model for the Greek city-states for the next 300 years. One such city was Pergamon, built in what is now Turkey in the 2nd century BC. The Pergamene rulers were neither democratic nor especially heroic, but they borrowed the heroic forms of Alexander's time and of classical Athens to express their ideals and values. But in their art, like the carvings on the great Altar of Zeus, the Pergamenes depicted the struggle between the gods, heroes and giants, between the rational and the irrational, with a violence and passion that the classical Athenians never permitted themselves.
You can feel the drill ripping into that stone to create that writhing hair of the giants. You can feel the chisel cutting away to create feathers or skin or scales, muscles or drapery or whatever. You can feel the rasp making those immense range of surface textures together with the polish. So here the sculptor is foregrounding his own technique. There's a notion of creativity going on here, which is quite different from anything that we've seen in the past. The technique of the Parthenon frieze is self-effacement. Here, the emphasis is on artistic creation.
The creative force of Greek art after Alexander has been reproduced ever since, in the direct copies of the Roman period, in the rediscoveries and recreations of the Renaissance, and in heroic art up to today.
The great altar of Pergamon is one of the most impressive and characteristic monuments from ancient Greek culture. And yet, at the time it was finished, about 170 BC, the age of these independent Greek city-states and kingdoms like Pergamon was nearing its end, as a new power pushed its order across the Mediterranean: Rome. The Romans conquered Greece in the middle of the 2nd century BC. They would surpass the Greeks in political power, in military might, in technological innovation. But the Romans would be forever in Greece's debt in the fields of philosophy, science, literature, and the arts. As the Roman poet said, "Captive Greece made Rome captive." The visual language devised by the Greeks would be adopted by the Romans and subsequently by the entire Western tradition. Indeed, it would become the preeminent means of portraying order, rationality, harmony, and power, whether in dictatorships, despotisms, or democracies. Ironically, though, the lesson which the Greeks understood and which their artists expressed in great works like this and in the Parthenon sculptures, namely that the disruptive and frightening forces of the irrational will always threaten to burst out in human history. That lesson would have to be learned again and again.
Rome began here, a cluster of little villages strung over these hills above the marshy valley of the river Tiber. Founded, according to legend, in the 8th century BC, at its heyday in the 2nd century AD, it ruled an empire whose soldiers stood guard from the windy hills of Hadrian's Wall in Scotland to the Persian Gulf, and whose merchants traveled as far afield as India and China. The culmination and the unifying of the old cultures of the Mediterranean world and Western Europe. From that day to this, Rome would be the greatest single influence on the Western cultural tradition. Indeed, it could be said that Rome is that tradition. It's not merely that Rome gave the West the Latin language, Roman law, Roman ideas on statecraft and on society. It was Rome which passed on to the West the artistic, philosophical, and spiritual legacy of ancient Greece, which Rome had conquered, looted, and then learned from. And it was Rome which would be the agency of transmission to the West of an obscure Near Eastern religious cult, which became the dynamic, motive force in Western society and spiritual life, Christianity. But Rome also gave the West a practical legacy. It's a legacy which Western people see every day of their lives, from Washington Square to Trafalgar Square. And that legacy lies in the realm of architecture, civil engineering, building, town planning. These were the Roman arts par excellence. And Roman thinkers came to view the goal of their empire as providing a peace in which those arts could flourish.
It was Caesar Augustus who brought the first real peace to a Rome weary of continual war and internal strife. In 13 BC, the Senate celebrated his triumphant return from Spain by dedicating to him an altar of Augustan peace. On the outer walls is a sculpted representation of that dedication ceremony, a procession of priests, officials, and members of the imperial family. This is to Roman art what the Parthenon frieze is to Greek art. A sense of order and serenity pervades the scene. At the head of the procession, between his two consuls, is the damaged but recognizable image of Augustus himself, dignified, though not yet deified. All the other figures are portraits too, such as Augustus' daughter Julia, later banished for immoral conduct, and her first husband, Augustus' minister Marcus Agrippa. Other reliefs celebrate the joy and fertility of nature in this time of peace. The universal harmony of the natural world is represented by the full-breasted, reassuring figure of Mother Earth herself.
The 100-foot-high column commemorating Trajan's victory over the Dacians shows the force required to keep the peace. Its unique spiral frieze tells of the discipline and resourcefulness of the Roman legions, moving by sea, assembling to hear their orders, building fortifications, raiding an enemy town, and crossing the Danube in small boats. The army is shown to be an awesome fighting machine, but there is no glorification of war itself, which is necessarily brutal and remorseless. The victory column and the triumphal arch through which the returning army marched, dragging slaves and spoils of war, were forceful forms of propaganda for the righteousness of imperial power, guided by the emperor, the Senate, and the people of Rome.